there's something called the Reid technique.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually really effective because it causes very impressionable, low IQ and child to adolescents to buy into the framing of leading questions or just outright lies by prosecutors or investigators. And so it solicits a really high false confession rate. So it has an error margin of 40 to 55%.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah. And then a study of 340 exonerated cases found that 42% of juvenile crimes were from false confessions. And that's at a rate of 2 to 3 times higher than adults. So the adults were at 13%. It has 9 steps of interrogation. So positive confrontation, which advises the suspect that the evidence has led the police to suspect the individual, and that offers the person an early opportunity to explain why the offence took place. So baked into that is, we know you did it, here's your first chance to confess. Then the second one is try and shift the blame away from the suspect to some other person or the circumstances that prompted the suspect to commit the crime. So that's saying, well, maybe it was this person, maybe it was the situation you found yourself in, and so this is your get out clause. This might allow someone to shift the blame if they did do it, or it might make someone suggestible and afraid, try and blame someone else and implicate them in the crime. So you get a sort of Salem witch trials thing going on. Then try and minimize the frequency of the suspect's denials. So try and I hesitate to say gaslight them, but do not affirm their ability to say that I didn't do it. You continue pressing them, saying we know you did, even if they didn't. At this point, then it says the accused will often give a reason why he or she did not or could not have committed the crime. Try and use this to move towards the acknowledgement of what they did. So even if they're telling you that they didn't, you have to take that as that they did. And then reinforce the sincerity to ensure that the suspect is receptive. So say, it's okay, we're going to help you through this, we're going to make sure that you get the most lenient sentence possible if you just tell us what you did. Then the suspect will become quieter and listen. Move the theme of the discussion toward offering alternatives. If the suspect cries at this point, infer guilt. Especially with children or people who are cognitively impaired, if they're crying under stress, you take this as a sign of guilt. So this is a technique that they're all taught to do. Pose the alternative question by giving 2 choices for what happened, one more socially acceptable than the other. The suspect is expected to choose the easier option, but whichever alternative the suspect chooses, guilt is admitted. There is always a third option, which is to maintain they did not commit the crime. Then number 8, lead the suspect to repeat the admission of guilt in front of witnesses and develop corroborating information to establish the validity of the confession. And then number 9, document the suspect's admission of confession or have him or her prepare a recorded statement, audio, video, or written. And so 81% of the false confessions from this result in convictions. So even though they know this is likely to lead to false confessions from children and cognitively impaired people, even though most of those that have been overturned on the basis of false confessions were that, 81% of the false confessions still lead to convictions. And this is the way in which the American 3-letter agencies are taught to interrogate suspects.
I knew it was bad from a methodological point of view in that it's almost designed to get false confessions. And I think that's effectively what it does. Yep. It's a very effective tool of getting confessions, whether they're truthful or not, is very different.
Yeah, if nobody's seen Making a Murderer, that is a really good example. So Brendan Dassey's 2016, his original confession was released in a document in 2016 by his post-conviction trial team, and that now reveals that law enforcement professionals themselves are using his confession tape as an example of how not to apply the Reid technique, but Brendan Dassey is still in prison. It's genuinely quite mad. So they're still using the technique, which has led to so many false confessions. And the example they use of how to achieve a false confession using the technique, the guy is still in prison, even though he's saying, I didn't do it. It's clearly broken.
To play devil's advocate here, it is really difficult not to be biased. And especially if you've invested a lot of time and energy and there's a lot of social pressure upon you to find someone guilty, then there is a tendency towards that sort of perhaps irresponsible questioning.
I don't want to write off all these techniques either, because I don't know if you've heard of the Chris Watts murders. There was a Netflix documentary on the American Murder Family Next Door, and the reason that he ended up confessing to not that his wife and kids had gone missing or run away, but that he'd actually killed his wife and kids and buried his kids in a giant oil tanker where he worked, was because he scored poorly on the polygraph. And so that prompted him to think the game was up. So it can correctly infer sometimes that people are lying and pressure them into being more forthcoming with their confessions. It's just not watertight. Neither is the Reid technique.
I mean, there are lots of different techniques to make people confess. Like you could, in theory, put like, I don't know, a toy stuffed monkey on the desk and just get inside someone's head, just like the monkey can tell you're lying. Because it's so strange, they're like, what? Well, it throws people off, it puts them off guard, and it kind of throws a cat amongst the pigeons in what they expect from the interview. And you can use anything as a sort of crutch to get people to confess if you can get inside their head and make them think it's all over when actually it's not.
Yeah, but I think a technique like that would also only properly work on, again, children and people who are quite impaired. And that's why you have to be quite careful as to who is present during the interrogation. I think they're trying still to pass a law in America that means that you cannot interrogate a minor or someone with a certain IQ level without either a lawyer or a guardian present, because that has been done plenty of times, like it was in the Dassey case.
I'm just going to go and get a really low IQ score in a test. I'm going to deliberately sabotage myself. So I know it's in the US, but still. Where was I? I think I read out number 2, didn't I?
Yes.
So step 3, after they've formulated the questions in a neutral way, which is easier said than done, the examiner conducts a pre-test interview to gather background information and establish a bit of rapport with the subject themselves and clarify the questions. I think a very important thing in telling whether someone's lying is understanding their mannerisms, how they actually talk normally. So talking to them in a way that's sort of friendly, where they're not incentivized to lie about things. So just like, how are you? Asking a few questions like, oh, where are you from? Getting them to talk a bit about themselves. It'll put them a bit at ease because that's a topic which they're familiar with. And therefore you can get a very clear picture of how someone acts when they're not under pressure. Yeah,
there's also 2 benefits to that. Either if they're guilty, it allows you to disarm them somewhat and make it easier to discern whether or not they're lying, or it might help them set them at ease if they're very apprehensive about taking the test because they're worried about getting a false positive because they genuinely are innocent. It might relax them a bit and not prejudice the physiological markers that might say that they would be lying.
Well, if they are relaxed as well, the spikes on the polygraph test will become more obvious. If they're running at a higher rate of anxiety, the extent that you can see the line from the deviation, it's sometimes quite difficult to infer whether something is a spike or whether it's just an anomalous result. For example, I've taken the galvanic skin response thing, and sometimes just having like an itch on my foot would make it spike.
Do you want to tell the story you told me off air or not? No, I didn't think you did.
Basically, the skin response thing gave away
that you found the examiner quite attractive.
Yes.
There we go.
But yeah, it works to some extent. But then also, it's just like, she's going to be looking at that in a minute, so I better control myself. And then all of a sudden, it was back to normal again. Yep. So it's not exactly that obvious sometimes, particularly if you're not looking at it at the time when it was being set up. But number 4, the subject is connected to the polygraph instruments, and baseline readings of physiological responses such as, blood pressure, heart rate, respiration are taken. And you need the baseline, obviously, to compare when they're asked questions. And you try and get an average. Quite often, this can be done in computer software now, where it calculates it for you rather than you having to eyeball it. And you can have it depending on the software that you use. This is true of a lot of neuroscientific software. If there's a significant peak from the average, what the software can do is test whether that difference is significant at a statistical level, which basically negates the probability that it's a product of chance compared to the baseline that you've established already. So it actually can be quite objective as long as the setup is correct and you approach it in the correct way. So number 5 is that the examiner asks a series of questions, believe it or not, which includes relevant questions to whatever they're trying to find out, as well as comparison questions, which are asked among the relevant questions just to establish a baseline response, because as questioning might go on, maybe they become more and more anxious. So that baseline might give you lots of false positives. So you don't want that. You want to consistently ask questions relative to the baseline, closest to the question you're asking in the sequence of questions, if that makes sense. And of course, you want some control questions as well, where you're just asking questions for the sake of it, just so it muddies the water in what you're actually asking about. Because, of course, most people are not stupid. Actually, that's a bit of a... I take that back. In this instance, people are smart enough to realise that, hey, maybe these questions that they're asking me about that person that they found dead, maybe that relates to them accusing me of murder.
This is one of the main problems actually with conducting psychological studies in universities, is because the majority of university study participants are psychology students, because you're trying to get credit, because one of your modules is how many lab hours do you do?
Yes.
And so what ends up happening is lots of the well-versed psychology undergrads start cracking the method as they're taking the test of the postgrads.
Not only that,
it.
I've gone so far to say to an experimenter, "Oh, you're investigating this topic, aren't you?"
Yeah, they just have to throw your results out.
Well, they don't necessarily, depending on the test.
Some of them should.
Some of them, for example, if it's things like visual perception, even if you know what you're doing, it doesn't really affect your result. And a lot of the research that goes on at universities is cognitive research. So it's more sensory data that isn't so metacognitive. It isn't so wrapped up in your consciousness. Therefore, knowing about it, being aware of it, isn't so important because the processes aren't conscious in the first place. But I've said to them before, "Oh, is your research paper titled something like this?" And they were just like, "Oh, that's pretty much it."
Yeah,
it was close, but I didn't get it spot on. But I was being a smart ass. So.
That's why it's quite difficult to do those sorts of studies, the non-sensory data ones that aren't subjected to the general public, because they will just crack the research method and might prejudice the results. So
the problem is as well, it's always very difficult to establish how obvious your research methodology is to the people taking it. Like I deliberately designed my master's research to be about as esoteric as possible. In fact, I lied to the participants about what I was investigating and only told them afterwards. I posed them questions about university decisions, and I was just like, well, I want to look at advice for people going to university. And I deliberately designed it about university choices because, of course, I was talking to master's students. They've been to university already. They would be someone who you would ask advice for. So it seems like a compelling reason to the people you're sampling. But then actually I was looking at how different numerical weightings in categories shift how people decide and the variance between those. And I only told them afterwards because you're allowed to deceive participants in the psychological realm, so long as you actually tell them later on down the line and the deception isn't seen as causing psychological harm.
See, that's quite interesting, because going back to the Reid technique, the Supreme Court in America in 1969, in a ruling called Frazier v. Cupp, says the police can just outright lie to suspects, not just if they're directly communicating with known serial killers, like they were in the papers with the Zodiac and BTK, and that's how they actually ended up catching BTK, because they said to him he was dropping off notes in like a Walmart parking lot, and they were trying to catch the truck, and they said, okay, if I send you a CD-ROM of all of the information about the killings, will you be able to trace me? And I know the police can't lie to me. Well, they could, so they just said, yeah, send it, we won't catch you, we swear, bro. And the CD-ROM was registered to Dennis Rader at the Christ Lutheran Church. It's like, ladies and gentlemen, we got him. But it's the fact that not only in certain circumstances can you lie in a psychological test, and you shouldn't for things like the Milgram experiment where you're going to traumatize people, but the police in America can just outright lie to not only people they know committed the crime, but suspects. And so that makes things like the Reid technique, particularly when applied to children or people that are cognitively impaired, error-fraught with disastrous consequences like false confessions.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.